Hi everyone, it's great to be back for the last panel of the Fusion Talks. I'm Ovidiu Babes and I'll be moderating this panel on behalf of the Qolony Association. So one thing I should say, yesterday we had a lot of great insights from like the major players of art and science promotion. We talked a lot about the main events, the main institutions, the main strategies of collaborating and promoting art and science. And now I think we're gonna zoom out a bit, as it were. We'll be a little more philosophical and try to answer the question of why art and science. We'll talk a bit about why arts and sciences are perceived as distinct disciplines, as it were, based on distinct types of like psychological states and distinct types of experiences. We'll talk a bit about how it all started historically and how actual scientists perceive and make use of artistic concepts. So welcome everyone. One thing I should mention at the beginning, if everyone has any question, and is watching on any streaming platform on Facebook and the like, they can just leave a comment and I will pick them up and try to give the best answer possible, right? So with us today are Adrian Currie. Hi, Adrian. Adrian is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Philosophy, and Anthropology at the University of Exeter. Adrian is a philosophy of science, and his work usually focuses on the so-called historical sciences, such as paleontology, archaeology, or geology. Yet he's written much about scientific methods, generally, creativity, and speculation in the sciences. Next up, we have Clive Cazeaux. Hi, Clive.
Hi.
Clive is a professor at Cardiff Metropolitan University in the UK. He works on aesthetics, philosophies of metaphor, and on artistic research generally. He published on continental aesthetics and generally on art and philosophy. There's also, I should mention, he also regularly writes on his Art Philosophy Junction blog. Next up, we will have Cezara Nicola. Hi, Cezara.
Hi, hello.
Cezara is a PhD student at the, let's see if I can say this right, Center for Excellence in the Image Study, or I think this is a translation. Anyway, at the University of Bucharest. And she's writing a dissertation on technology and European contemporary art, especially cyber art. And our last speaker today is going to be Diana Andreea Novaceanu. Hi, Diana. Glad to have you on board. She's also a PhD student at the Center for Excellence in Image Study. And Diana is writing about how medical practice reflects in contemporary art. So if all is well, I would just give the floor to Adrian and ask him to say a couple of words.
Sure, thanks. Really delighted to be here. I really love getting an opportunity to sort of come in and sort of talk in such a sort of relaxed way with such a diverse bunch of folks. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this goes. So as Ovidiu said, I'm a philosopher of science. And so my interest here is very much coming in on the sort of sciencey side. I take it that, Clive's going to bring it in from the outside. It'll be interesting to see how that comes together. So if we're going to ask why science and art, maybe the first thing we might want to do is to sort of distinguish between, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to start drawing lots of distinctions, so see if you can keep up with them. You might want to distinguish between science and art as like institutions and the kinds of judgments, attitudes and beliefs that we tend to associate with those institutions. So I can talk about science and art, and I can talk about, as it were, truth and beauty, or epistemology and aesthetics. So I'll talk first about sort of science and art, the institutions, because it's really, I think, an important thing to remember that it's not as if when God was creating the world, she said, there's this thing called art and there's this thing called science, and forever shall they be. These are cultural institutions that emerge in historical contexts that have the form they do due to various forms of historical accidents, right? So one thing that's so fascinating about the history of science and the history of art is just how contingent the things turn out to be. Hopefully other people may speak in a more informed way than me about the actual details of those kinds of contingencies. But as a philosopher of science who's interested in understanding how science works and scientific practice and those sorts of things, it's really important to realize that, science is the way it is because humans have made decisions about it. Art is distinguished from science in the way that it is because these are things that have histories, and we think about them in those ways. There's nothing fundamental, so far as I can tell, about kind of this thing called science and this thing called art built into the sort of bedrock of knowledge or human activities. It's just that's how things turned out, and they could have been real different, it seems to me. But we might think something different about this sort of other set of things instead of science and art: epistemology and aesthetics. These are big fancy words that philosophers like using. It's very unclear what either of them mean. Epistemology means like pertaining to knowledge, and aesthetics means pertaining to like beauty and those things. It seems like we have sets of epistemic judgments. Like my epistemic judgments might be things like, that is a well-reasoned argument. I might think, that is good evidence. I might think that is a satisfying explanation. These seem to be judgments about knowledge in some way. And similarly, I might have aesthetic judgments. That's a pretty painting. That's a ugly tasting food, right? We have these various judgments in these various stances, and we tend to pull them apart, right? I've just said there's these knowledgey ones and there's these aestheticsy ones. And once I probably gave examples, you're like, oh yeah, sometimes I make judgments about whether something is, say, true or likely to be true or well-reasoned. And sometimes I make judgments about whether something is beautiful or ugly or fills me with awe or something like that. We tend to pull these things apart and think about them separately in lots of ways. And often when people think about science and art, they really emphasize the epistemology bit of science and the aesthetics bit of art, right? And I think once you start really paying attention to what both artists and scientists do, you start to realize that that's a kind of mistake. And what's interesting is that that mistake is kind of really built into some fundamental things about the way that philosophers have conceived of sort of values in certain ways, right? We tend to think about science as aiming for a certain type of objectivity. We associate the epistemology stuff with, being objective, being external, being quantified. We tend to associate the aesthetic stuff with subjective things, with particular individual feelings, our individual reactions, and these kinds of things. But there's something quite mysterious about that if you start paying attention to the way that scientists talk about their own work. When scientists talk about their work, they very quickly start grabbing aesthetic notions. The most obvious cases of this, of course, are cases where people talk about the beauty of theories or the beauty of experiments. So the double slit experiment, which is an experiment which I'm not going to explain because it would take too long and I would get confused, but effectively is a very, very good way of confronting you with the weirdness of quantum effects. Was voted the most polled from scientists, the most beautiful experiment. This is something that scientists just talk about their work in this very aesthetic way. And sometimes they seem to even appeal to aesthetic concepts when they're defending their claims. You might say that a theory is elegant. You might say that something is simple. You might say that something is sort of beautiful. Some scientists, it seems as if there's some connection between something's aesthetic properties and its epistemic properties, which is a very fancy way of saying maybe something's being beautiful might be a reason to think that it's true. On the face of it, that's quite mysterious. So we have a puzzle here. On the one hand, we seem to think a lot about tend to think that science aims for a kind of pure epistemic thing. Science is not supposed to involve individual subjective judgments. And yet, when scientists defend their views, they seem to appeal to things that look a lot like aesthetic values. What are we supposed to do? One thing we might do is we might say, well, actually, beauty is a guide to truth. We might say that those judgments are, in fact, things that lead us to truth. This might be the sort of thing you would say if, for instance, you were someone who believed that there was a benevolent being who made the world, right? If you think that someone made the world and this person, is very, very brilliant and very, very loving, then their brilliance and their lovingness would be reflected in the world. If you don't believe something like that, if you don't have those kinds of theistic beliefs, then it becomes a lot more unclear as to why it is I should think that something being pretty or being simple or being elegant is any guide to truth whatsoever, right? And so we might start wondering, how do scientists make use of aesthetic things and their aesthetic judgments, and is that a problem? Right? You might worry. You might say, well, if scientists are just appealing to these subjective aesthetic judgments, if it's just that these scientific ideas make my brain tickle in a nice way, my brain tickling in a nice way seems to be no guide to this being true or this being a good argument. For what it's worth, my take on all of this is that we should think about aesthetics as being deeply embedded in human activity. I think there's a real problem the way that philosophers in particular, some philosophers, traditionally philosophers, have thought about aesthetics as in terms of the appreciation of pure forms or pure aesthetic properties. I think if you're going to think about how aesthetic stuff plays into scientific practice, you've really got to think about aesthetics in a much more low-falutin rather than highfalutin way. Aesthetic judgments are intertwined with and merge with our epistemic judgments. When you learn to become a scientist, when you're trained to be a scientist, all of these aesthetic judgments that you have, feelings of things being complete, things looking right, things being elegant, things being beautiful, etc., are trained and co-opted to those sorts of scientific purposes. So in my view, it's not that truth is a guide to beauty or beauty is a guide to truth, but rather what scientific training does is it trains you to see beauty in true things. It allows you to use your way that you recognize beauty to recognize truth. Of course, as a philosopher, I don't know what I mean by beauty or truth there. But the idea is if we want to understand how science works, we need to take aesthetics really, really seriously. Because I think it's aesthetic judgments and aesthetic sensibilities which play an enormous role in a lot of scientific activities. But to do that, we're really going to have to break down these kind of artificial barriers that we've built between aesthetics and epistemology, and indeed, if you want, between science and art. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Cool. So now if there are any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or raise your hand if you're on Zoom. Just one thing. So I was thinking, I can help it. There's a lot to think about in what you said, right? One thing I kind of really liked is that you said how could beauty, let's say, be any guide to truth, and we shouldn't think of it like that. But I mean, scientists are people, and people, for instance, gain understanding whenever they do science. And one might say, well, suppose I understand a theory, why should that be any guide to truth, right? I mean, is this isn't this like a gradual scale? Isn't this like a continuum between, let's say beauty, then understanding, then simplicity, then blah, 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 and then truth? Why should we think of them as really like split?
Good. Yeah. So, I mean, hopefully by the end, it became clear that this is one of those cases where in order to tear down a distinction, I have to first make the distinction.
You didn't. Yeah.
And so I actually sort of agree that, there are these sort of features of human psychology that play these kinds of roles. But I do sort of wonder a little bit, like there are, just as there are aesthetic responses, there are also epistemic responses. Like that, the most obvious one is the aha moment, right? Is when you grab something, you understand something. And I think that quite often there are sort of various sort of practices we have which trigger the aha moment, but in a sort of unjustified way, right? So you might think of some conspiracy theories might be a bit like this, because they give you a sort of unified explanation in certain ways that tickles your your little brain, your little bit of pro-epistemology bit in your brain, and you go, oh yeah. But actually it's misfiring. I think you see interesting examples of this across different scientific disciplines. So different scientists are trained to like different things. So certain types of economists, for instance, are very much trained towards understanding economic activity in terms of rational actors and how those rational actors might behave. And they're used to understanding
Definitely, yeah.
things in those ways. But then other, say, historians, for instance, are trained to understand things in terms of mess, in terms of complexity.
Contingencies and stuff.
Yeah, and so they have different responses, right? When they see those, they have different expectations in terms of what a good explanation looks like. And those things involve both these kinds of epistemic responses, but also these aesthetic judgments, right? An economist will look at a certain type of explanation and go, that is the right type of explanation. That's very simple and very pretty and good. Whereas an historian might look at the exact same explanation and go, that's ugly. And what they mean by that is that's not what I've been trained to see as a likely or a good explanation.
Great, thanks. Clive?
Thank you. Hi, Adrian. I enjoyed your talk and fully agree with the claim you're making. But what I wanted to ask is, you say that we shouldn't see these two subjects as being distinct. There should be encouragement for scientists to see beauty as a guide to truth. But is that something that a scientist could ever admit to and include in an article? Or would it always have to be something that's kind of the dinner anecdote, the thing that's kind of kept to the margins because scientific journals, scientific method won't allow you to be, in inverted commas, that subjective?
That's a really nice question, right? If I sort of want to really emphasize the role of sort of aesthetic judgment in science, how should that play into the way that scientists present their work? Should there be, there are some sciences where things a little bit like this might happen. So if you think about the way that some archaeologists will keep field notes when they're doing excavations, what they're really trying to track is the kind of reasoning that they're using and the expectations and the assumptions that they're making while they're doing the excavation. And that will include stuff like, I think that this house was quite pretty, so therefore I think it's probably going to look like that, or, making this up, but you get the idea. So sometimes there are sort of recordings of those kinds of judgments. But you're right that in the way that sort of scientific papers are presented, it's very much, here's my method, here are my results, here's how it goes. I suppose I would be willing to say that actually, I think it would be good if scientists were much more explicit about those aesthetic judgments. And I think it's because those aesthetic judgments actually play a really important part of why they accept the things they accept, why within that community, scientists kind of like that. The real challenge, though, of course, is that one of the ways in which science tries to, as it were, construct its authority, if you want, is by keeping this idea that somehow what they're doing is universal, or somehow what's going on is not subject to those kinds of idiosyncratic aspects. But I guess I tend to think about science in a very, I suppose, in a way which is at least a little bit sort of Kuhnian, a little bit paradigmy, right? The way that you become a scientist is you go through a training process which gives you a whole bunch of expectations and knowledge and all these things that then shape the way you see the world. And so I think that they should be more explicit about the way they see the world has been shaped. So I'd be willing to go so far as to say, why not in articles have a bit where you get explicit about the aesthetic values that you're appealing to.
So every article should have an art bit.
Yeah. And there are ones that, like you do see, so what philosophers of science who work on sort of aesthetics, spend a lot of time just grab a scientific paper and read the introduction and the discussion. And you'll find like aesthetic-ish, sort of claims quite often. Like, you have to squint your eyes a little bit. I sometimes worry that they're cheating. It's like, I don't know if simplicity is actually an aesthetic concept per se, but, you do find appeals to this kind of thing, so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask another question if there's no one else in queue. So Yeah, so I really liked about what you said about, you know, the aesthetic values of scientists being somehow learned and somehow, you know, paradigmatic, as it were. I don't want to use these words, but you know, I mean, economists tend to think in a certain way about beauty, while, you know, historians tend to think in a very different way. And actually, this reminds me of this paper I read about mathematicians being like super bad at agreeing with each other of why a certain demonstration is beautiful, but at the same time they were agreeing like 99.9% of those specific demonstrations being beautiful. So they all agreed that these were beautiful. They did not agree about why. But anyway, what I wanted to ask you is maybe to, you know, try to sketch out how in this case novelty is kind of acquired. So, you know, scientists do kind of progress in some fields, right? So new findings are put to the table and so on. So how do you then, I mean, if your aesthetic values are kind of acquired through education, how do you learn to recognize the beauty of, you know, of future kind of findings and so on? So say you find something new or you develop some new idea. How do you know if it's beautiful or not if you haven't learned it?
Great. I mean, I take it.
Way.
Yeah, I mean, I take it the sort of easy answer is just, you know, I know a set of things that are beautiful. If I see another thing that's similar, I'll find that as being beautiful as well. But one thing sort of behind that question, I take it, is that what's going to count as significant is going to seem to be constrained by that learning process. And that's going to be as true of things that we think of as epistemic-y as it is of things that we think of as being aesthetics-y. So, you know, so there are, you know, one thing I think about a fair bit is, in virtue of what do scientists find a new thing significant? And I think that's as kind of, you know, if you want, paradigm bound as any other thing in science. So here's a sort of, I think, fairly easy example. If you're doing paleoanthropology, so you're interested in understanding human origins, the evolution of sort of our lineage, there's this obsession with finding the earliest, the first, the one that's like, you know, there's this sort of obsession with kind of trying to extend these kind of barriers. You're interested in things that are found in unexpected places because you're interested in identifying the dates, as it were, at which things happened. And it's interesting because actually I think that the new evidence that we've sort of had in paleoanthropology over the last 10 to 15 years show that actually the way that, as it were, we became human is way more messy than the picture of, oh, here's the event, here's where it happened. You can't point to a bit and say, here's where we became human. It was rather a very broken, distributed, messy process. And if you're looking at a broken, distributed, messy process, then you should expect to find random bits and pieces here and there. You shouldn't be so excited by finding, oh, look, it's the earliest. That's just not as important. And so I think that you do find these cases where your expectations are kind of driving a practice which is no longer in step with the things you've found out. But the thing that I kind of always note is that, and this is something I take from, say, so Alison Wiley's work, is there's this real power in the materiality of what scientists do. When we sort of start thinking about paradigms and getting worried about all this stuff in the scientist's head and their collected beliefs and all this kind of stuff, you start worrying, how could we progress? We progress because all of that stuff is bouncing off the world. Scientists are poking things in experiments, they're digging things up out of the ground, and that materiality and that physicality really resists sometimes. It won't do whatever you want it to. You know, human imagination cannot force something to be something that it is not. And so I think that interaction with that materiality is really where you start sort of seeing the progress.
Great, thanks. I was thinking, you know, I have no idea about arts. I'm not an artist. I never was. But I, you know, I would be curious to see how would like artists think about this. So say they believe the same thing. Say they believe that, you know, they have certain aesthetic judgments based on what they learned and so on. I'm wondering if this means that if you are to now connect art and science, people on the art side and on the science side should just be, pluralistic about what beauty and aesthetic values be, just because they know that they have not been trained in the same way. They know that they would not recognize the same things as beautiful and so on. I mean, I'm really curious if, merging art and science nowadays would imply that people should just lower their aesthetic judgments to the point where, no, I have to be educated again, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to get re-educated in order to make up a new kind of mix between.
Yeah, it's a really good, really good question, Ovidio. So I'm very interested in hearing what everyone else thinks about this particular question. So I have a tendency to think about human aesthetic judgments as being extremely plastic, which is to say there's a huge range of different things that we might, make positive or negative aesthetic judgments about. It may be that there are some constraints. Maybe there are some things that it's easy to make us think are ugly and something that it's easy to make us think are pretty or whatever. But I think that generally speaking, these things are really products of our enculturation. They really are products of the experiences that we have, and, so on and so forth. I think that's definitely going to be, I think, as true of art as it is sort of the aesthetic judgments in science. And I think this makes sense. I think that, the relationship, one thing I didn't sort of mention in the talk that I think is an interesting other angle here is I was talking about how the aesthetics feeds into the epistemology, but there's also how the epistemology feeds into the aesthetics, right? When I come to know that something is... when I come to know about something, I tend to be better placed to find it beautiful, maybe, right? I have this experience with historical things all the time. Me knowing the history of the house I live in really helps me have this kind of aesthetic experience of appreciating the way the house is. It seems like having knowledge of how someone did something, why they did it like that, things like this, really enrich our aesthetic experience. There's a question about whether that is correct, right? Which is part of what you're sort of getting at, right? If aesthetic experience is only ever tied to particular traditions or particular sort of ways of seeing, if you want, or ways of experiencing, then it might be that there's just nothing to say. We have to be sort of pluralistic about it. And I think personally, I'm just completely fine with that. But also, I think a lot of people who work in aesthetics would very much disagree with me on that. So this is a sort of particular view that I have, where I tend to be very, very subjectivist and culturally constrained about the way I think about aesthetics.
Right. Okay, great.
Adrian, your comment made me think very much of the type of artists who very much have their own unique aesthetic judgments, but also engage with very rigorous scientific practices, such as is the case of Christine Borland, who is an A+ scientist. Her methodologies are incredible. And at the same time, she is very subversive in the way in which she uses the scientific process as a sort of mirroring of itself and of its own biases, the racial biases, the sexual biases, and so on.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about, when you break down that barrier between sort of science and art, like it's very clear to me that something which is very similar to between what scientists do and what artists do is they're both, I think, it's very hard to make general claims here, but I'll boldly make one anyway. Both seem to be fundamentally interested in exploring the possibility of, sometimes they're sort of conceptual spaces, sometimes they're spaces that are bound by the materials that they're working with. They're interested in exploring the sort of range of variation, the range of expression, but they're often done towards different ends. Right. So one way in which, if I was going to distinguish between science and art, I think, which was, I think, really nicely in your question there, is I think scientists often are trying to do a different thing to artists. Both are valuable, both are interesting, and both involve exploring ranges of expression. But I think they're exploring those ranges of expression towards different ends. And a quick version of the ends is something like, well, actually, science is art has got too many ends for me to be able to actually, it would be a fool's game to say it's for this, right? Whereas science at least tends to be towards producing new things like new knowledge or getting a grant or making a new product or making a paper, those sorts of things. So they're towards different ends, but I think there's something very similar about the way you're exploring different possibility spaces.
Thank you, Adrian.
I have a question as well, if I may.
Yeah, sure. I think Clive had his hand up before, but
sorry. Then Clive, go ahead. I can wait.
I've already asked a question, so I'm happy to hand over to you, Cezara. Yeah.
I'll be very brief. Adrian, I'm going to direct this question to you as well. I was just wondering, because we've been talking about including artistic judgment into scientific articles, what with Clive's question before. And I was just wondering, what does including an artwork that is based on science or that includes scientific elements, so what is placing science in the realm of art, in the space of an exhibition, let's say, so a cultural space? What does it do to the scientific message? Does it enhance it? Does it take something from it? Is it something else entirely?
Yeah, that's a really great sort of set of things to think about, right? When we, practically, if we start really thinking about art and science, and particularly the sort of products of them as sort of more closely related, right? There are sort of relatively straightforward things to say to do with, say, pedagogy, right? Do with sort of and communication, right? So there's lots of really, I don't remember anyone's name ever, so I'm not going to be able to say there's this artist that does this thing, but there's lots of really interesting work that's sort of exploring the relationship of dance with various ways people think about molecular systems and these sorts of things. And often there's sort of, audience participation where you get people to, do this dance, and what you're doing is you're making the same pattern as this, molecular system does, or that sort of thing. And that's a really interesting way of, because human, one of the reasons why I think aesthetics are so important for science is because I think knowledge is often embodied. I think that knowledge is not a set of sentences in your head. I think often it's tacit. It's about, it's know how rather than know that, to use the sort of philosophical locution there. And if you think that, then actually less propositional ways of getting people to engage with knowledge, which is what art is often doing, right? Art is not often presenting an idea by saying, here's the idea in words or something. Sometimes it is. But the idea that you can immerse people in an experience, and that experience gives them some kind of embodied insight into what the science is telling them, strikes me as a sort of incredibly rich way of thinking about it. And that doesn't just have to be about science communication, but also about scientific practice. Because if you're a scientist, you have to think in many interesting, intimate ways about your system of study. And, doing art and producing art and having artists come in and think about with you that system of study can be an incredibly rich way of, being creative as a scientist, of thinking outside the box, if you want. But I think that it's much more than just that sort of cheesy, let's go and, do some art together and that'll be fun and blah, blah, blah. It's, if knowledge is kind of really tied up with aesthetics, then those sorts of artistic practices are really getting at the heart of what scientific knowledge is. That's me being extremely bold.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to pick up on Adrian. You said you were uncertain whether there would be any philosophers of art who would agree that the more you know, the more you might find something beautiful. But I think Kant would work very well here, because beauty for Kant is always concepts being in a state of free play. So the more concepts you have, the more that can stoke a more intense sense of beauty. And to introduce perhaps a controversial example would be wine tasting. if we accept that concepts aren't just ideas in the head, but means of perceiving, then arguably a wine taster has more concepts on their tongue than a non-wine taster, and has a much more richer aesthetic experience when they taste wine than someone who's not familiar with drinking wine. So Kant might be an ally here.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are, there are certainly quite a large number of people working in aesthetics who they're sometimes called cognitivists, who are people who believe that if you get more knowledge of the art, including like the history of the art, for instance, that objectively makes you a better aesthetic appreciator of it. So Derek Turner has a beautiful book called Paleoaesthetics, where he tries to make this claim in the context of paleontology and archaeology. I am not technically a cognitivist because I don't agree with that objective bit, right? And that's the thing where like when I said I don't know if any aestheticians would agree with me or many would agree with me. It's more my kind of resistance to the idea that we should think about aesthetics in anything other than a very sort of local embodied cultural sense. Certainly puts me at odds with most of let's say mainstream analytic aesthetics. I'm fairly comfortable not being on that side though.
I think we can jump in for Clive's talk. Clive, would you like to?
Okay, yes, thank you, Video. I'll just share my screen. Is that working for everyone? Have you got
Yep.
the screen saying
good.
Why Art and Science? Okay, thank you. And thank you to Floriana for the invitation. So yes, the invitation was to talk about why art and science. So I've thought about the question and would like to take two approaches, a historical one and one that looks at the relationship in the present. Like Adrian, I'm a philosopher. I work in aesthetics and have a particular interest in the aesthetics of science, not as well, both in terms of beauty, but also aesthetics in that original Greek sense of what comes to us through the senses. So the materiality of science, which is what Adrian was talking about. But in this talk, I'm looking very much at how we understand the distinction. So why do we have this distinction? And I'd like to suggest there are perhaps four events in recent history, in the history of modernity, that might be responsible. In the United Kingdom, we have this text that was published in 1959 by the critic C.P. Snow called The Two Cultures, which was the observation that those people versed in the sciences were starting to kind of split away from those versed in the arts, and we have these two cultures. And the event that he identified as perhaps being the cause was the Industrial Revolution, this explosion of the production of technology, automation, electronics. So life just becomes more mechanically directed, expanded, and this in turn helps to advance science. Suddenly there are more means of accessing reality. So typically the creation of lenses, microscopes, but just the ways in which nature can be accessed grows. So this is the scientific revolution that grows from the Industrial Revolution. I think secondly, science has a very successful set of methods. It's and obviously I can't do justice to all of those here, but taking what might be three of the headline methods used by science: observation and experimentation, inductive and deductive reasoning, and the formation and testing of hypotheses. And why are they so successful? Well, I think it was something that Adrian referred to, which is science is always kind of prodding the world. It's always engaging with the causal joints of the world, and has to somehow be answerable to them. And so these are things we might observe through a lens. These observations then can form the basis of reasoning, which has to keep to the laws of logic. And then once we've formed a hypothesis, you can test it. So at every stage, you've either got reality to confirm or deny what you're doing, or you've got logic. So, it's such a successful enterprise, and I think this is why in many countries it is now seen as the paradigm of knowledge. Now, I say that as someone as probably we're all aware, we're all working in the arts and humanities, and the amount of funding that is given to science is enormous compared to the very small amount that is given to the arts. The third event I'd like to identify is a text from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, The Question Concerning Technology, where he attacks what technology has become in modern times. And he says that technology, we often think of technology as simply being a means to an end. We have the intention, we design a tool, and then we carry out our end. But he says this is not the case at all. Technology is a force in the world, and what he calls it inframes the world, it inframes nature. That is, it arranges it into a certain way of being, it arranges it according to certain priorities, and in doing so, we lose sight of other possibilities, other aspects of nature. Perhaps a really good example, given Heidegger's ecological ambition, would be the way in which the farming industry is very much governed by commercial and petrochemical interests. So the amount of chemicals that are used to supposedly enhance crop yield, but in so doing kill other creatures, deaden the soil, and just kind of close down lots of other aspects of nature. But this, Heidegger says, is one effect of technology. And so this is another way in which we might think of technology and a certain scientific way of looking. Heidegger was quite critical of science. Is another reason why there might start to be a concentration of investment in art and in science and technology on one side and art on the other. And then finally, we have modernism, modern art. Art as a reaction to both the idea of the modern human being, a human being distinct from God, but also art as a response to what's happening to the world through science and technology. So although modernism is this wonderful parade of new kinds of image and sculpture making, it's a very reactive practice. So Impressionism is a reaction to photography and the interest in light. Cubism is a reaction to this sudden interest in time within physics, and artists trying to find different ways of portraying time on a canvas. And Futurism, the reaction to how we might respond to the way life is speeding up. So I think four moments that might explain why we have this distinction historically. But what should we do with this distinction today? And I want to very briefly map out six considerations. Firstly, depending on, well, it's a point for debate, but this is the era of contemporary art, where contemporary doesn't just mean what's of the moment. It's art after conceptual art. That's what many art theorists, how they define contemporary art after conceptual art. Essentially, there are now no limits on what form art can take. Now that art can be a ready-made, a urinal, an unmade bed, a shark in a tank, that there's no material limits on what form the art can take. And that means we're in a situation of or how do we now judge art? How do we now evaluate it? How do we recognize it? And so there's a whole new set of, well, not new, but work done on trying to work out what does art do. If we can't distinguish, this object from that object as art, we need to be looking for other things. And certain key concepts are to do with play, transformation, working between categories and metaphor. And this, I think, is a useful reference point to thinking what might, we might not know what art is, but we perhaps can think of how it might engage with science. Secondly, this theme came up yesterday, talk of art being the communication of science or the illustration of science. I struggle with this. I think it came out yesterday because a couple of speakers said it was often seen as quite important to winning funding if you can say your art will communicate science. But I think, is this art or is this actually just illustration, serving the interests of another subject? Arguably, it's a good thing. The more we understand about, I'm not anti-science. The more we can understand about scientific discovery, scientific process, and illustration can help that. I think that's a worthwhile activity, but I don't think it's necessarily art. It's illustration. And I think the more adventurous possibilities come in the next few lines. We have the notion of science fiction, and I quite like the name sci-art, just as fiction tries to explore what scientific concepts are adding to reality. Art is engaging in some way with what science is doing with the world. And firstly, the idea that sci-art might be what I call an aesthetic explication of science. What do I mean by that? It's going back to that point that Adrian introduced, that science is always material. It must at some point always be referring to reality, but how is that reality brought to the senses? It's going to be some form of perhaps data capture or some form of imaging or some form of detection, but there is an aesthetic there in the sense of the Greek aesthetic of coming to the senses. We have to make what we're looking at manifest to us. And that process of manifestation, or bringing into view, the idea that we now need microscopes the size of small towns to actually engage with things that are infinitesimally small. So this idea that there is a sensory material dimension to science that needs explicating, unfolding, that might be one role. I think fourthly, I said versus the romantic genius. This was the idea that the artists, perhaps the role now is not simply to see oneself as an isolated individual who is somehow internally in touch with nature, which is what the romantic genius is, but has to pay very close attention to scientific process, scientific method, and to find within that new aesthetic possibilities that are perhaps surprising, or perhaps can go away from perhaps what a scientist might need, but are still somehow valuable. Fourthly, this is Heidegger's point that if science and technology are successful because they impose a certain view of the world, then we need art to somehow work against that, to remind us that there are other ways of seeing, other ways of acting. And I think Helena yesterday touched on this when she, from Ars Electronica, when she referred to artists being, or should be playing with technology, not perhaps using it for its intended purpose, which would be a means of inframing for Heidegger, but actually finding something non-functional, playful, surprising, transformative, that just says, look, other ways of working with this is possible. They might not lead to anything, but they do call attention to the fact that this piece of kit is a way of revealing and it can reveal in one way, it can also reveal in other ways. The fifth suggestion is that one value of art science is that it's about what happens when two groups with very different methods work alongside one another, and that this as a practice where you're not geared towards an outcome, but you're more just attentive to the differences between you and the value of working with another. And these ideas of Mitsein again come from Heidegger, and also the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy talks about the value of being with, of Mitsein, and that there is something inherently valuable of collaboration, even independently of what the outcome might be, and that this is something that could be made visible. That will be an aesthetics of being with, or Mitsein. And an epistemology of being with would be just recognizing that sometimes insights can come from observing that the way in which another subject works with concepts actually yields insight for your own subject. And then finally, the fairly new subject, I say new, it's perhaps been with us for about 30 years, of artistic research, which is sometimes called practice-based research. And I think the phrase was adopted to draw a distinction with scientific research. But just the artistic research is a very valuable practice because it's seeking to find other theories of knowledge. It often attracts the criticism of being overly subjective or not sufficiently grounded. But I think these attacks can always be challenged themselves, because philosophy has done a lot of work on what it means to be subjective. And there are many ways around the way people, that coherence can be in the way people think, speak, offer judgments, can be a source of knowledge. So the sixth possibility is that perhaps we should understand art and science as an area of artistic research where we're actually looking for different ways of knowing. So yes, these are two perspectives on why art and science, looking at some of its historical origins and suggesting some attitudes on the way we should think about the relationship in the present. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll stop sharing if I can.
Thank you very much, Clive.
If I can find the button.
Right, cool. So again, if anyone watching live on Facebook or other streaming platform has any question, feel free to write it in the chat and we will pick it up. Adrian.
Thanks, Clive. That was a really nice sort of broad set of sort of things to sort of think with. I really liked it. I wonder, so both of us gave this kind of extremely, in a way, pro-science sort of notion of why it is that science is so successful, right? We sort of said, oh, well, scientists are good at poking the world and things like this. And there's another type of history you might tell, where you talk about the way that science gets embedded within various kinds of economic and power structures, so you start seeing, there's a story to tell about the industrialization of science, particularly after the Second World War, and the ways in which it's tied in with these various sort of funding things and these sort of systems, that sort of thing. And I wonder, I'd be sort of interested in hearing what your perspective is on these two seemingly quite different explanations for why science is successful. And just a very, very quick anecdote to sort of get the story right. I remember doing a workshop with paleontologists and philosophers, and we were talking about, the philosophy of paleontology. And I sort of said, why is paleontology successful? That's my fundamental question. And one of them said, oh, it's very easy. Paleontologists are good at securing funding. And by that, they didn't mean that because they had the funding, they were able to then do science. it was more that the funding kind of just was what the success was, right? And so there's these two quite different ways of conceiving that question. So I was interested in like how you see the relationship between those two explanations of science's success.
So is it on the one hand, the success of science because of its kind of epistemological strengths, and then on the other hand, the fact that it's become so almost like the paradigm of knowledge, the fact that it's almost, it kind of now affects our values.
Yeah, I mean, a way that we might do it is with the way that you were describing the history, you could describe it slightly differently and say, this is the way that scientists and their allies constructed the sort of platform of authority upon which science speaks, right? There's a way of thinking about this, not in terms of science getting at the truth, but rather science positioning itself in a powerful way within society.
I suppose I recognize that, and it annoys me intensely. Perhaps one form of that annoyance is there a certain class of scientists who say philosophy is dead. We as scientists have the means to answer all the major questions. Is that the kind of thing you're pointing at, or?
If you wish to talk about those scientists, go for it.
And I think that's because I would say, I think the reason why it happens is because science always has reality as its guarantor, and that's very reassuring if you're in charge of a research council and you've got to prove to government that you've allocated your money wisely. You can say, well, this team here, they're scientists. They're ultimately answerable to reality. We're confident that they can deliver the goods. The people on this side, they're artists. They're a bit more open to interpretation. There's a bit more, perhaps some vagueness there, and we can't quite be clear on what we're going to get from it socially. Or that just gives them less funding. So I think that's why it happens. The danger is that it forgets that there are other ways of knowing, that knowledge can take many forms, and that not just to do with perhaps science itself having to find new ways of looking, but that I suppose the intersubjectivity is extremely valuable in of itself, and if we ever needed a demonstration of that, the value that has been recognized on the care sector in the pandemic, the fact that so many people's lives have either been saved or impaired because they did not have access to a situation of care. So I think it's perhaps an over just needing to feel that you're putting the money in the right place and not having enough confidence in the value of intersubjectivity.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully put. I mean, one way that I sort of think about this is, after sort of spending a lot of time studying science, and particularly different sciences, the idea that there's some scientific method that you can appeal to becomes increasingly laughable. So it's not just that, as you so nicely articulated, you've got, other ways of knowing outside of science. There are also many ways of knowing within science. And different scientists are often extremely unsensitive to that fact, because you work within your little narrow bounds, and you tend to assume that that's how. This is why there's always a disaster when a scientist goes into the next room and talks to their neighboring scientists and like, what are you doing? It's because there are many different ways of knowing within science, and once you see that, then it becomes much easier to sort of go, yeah, artists very clearly have really interesting ways of knowing, as do, as you say, people in the caring sector, as do, right? So as soon as you give up the sort of myth of there being a sort of unified authoritative scientific method, and realize that what makes something justified depends on the local stuff. You have to go and look at it. You can't, there are, you don't have to be just like blanket skeptical or anything like that. Of course, science works real good most of the time, but there is no easy answer to say, here's why this works and this is the right knowledge, I guess. That wasn't a question. That was just me bouncing off what you said.
It always comes back to, I think being able to measure, being able to quantify, the number of times during the pandemic we've heard politicians say, give me the data. And okay, one can talk about qualitative properties in terms of data, but it's a bit of a mangle. But I think that is so reassuring, but it's very dangerous, because there's all those other rich questions about, well, what should we talk about before we decide to actually measure it or quantify it?
I can literally keep going all day, so like I'll pause and see if other people have questions, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, you can just follow up if you like. I do have one question. So it's not so clear. I'll try to formulate it the right way. So I love the way you, Clive, presented this sort of kind of very large-scale dialectics between, like historical dialectics between art and science at the beginning, saying, so for instance, like Cubism was kind of a reaction to a certain, understanding of time, of theory of relativity, and so on. And your presentation like really made me think about things at the very, very large scale. That's one thing. But it also kind of made me think, we can think of art and science as two of these really global, wholesome kind of disciplines, or whatever you may call them. But on the other hand, I think we can also think about their interactions or dialectics or what have you on a very like local and kind of nitty-gritty way. So for instance, whenever, some scientist models something or illustrates some stuff, or learns how anatomy, how muscles look like, right, in anatomy or so on. Unavoidably he is kind of immersed into some sort of aesthetic experience. So I was thinking about, do you think we should think of art and science in this like very global and zoomed out way, or do you think there's a different picture to be had on the like nitty-gritty side of the merging?
I think there's always a danger of taking concepts in the abstract and in a very broad sense, because to reach for one of the philosophical debates that I always think is key, and it comes from two 18th century philosophers, George Berkeley in Ireland and Immanuel Kant in Prussia or Germany. As soon as you take concepts away from any application to sensory physical detail, you're in trouble. And that there was a historical reason for that. So I think broadening concepts too far is dangerous. I think the main danger with art and science would be, I think science is methodologically very rich, very complex, but always has to be answerable in some ways. Whereas art, if you accept the thesis about contemporary art, that there's no constraints now. If you say you're an artist, in one sense, that says nothing now. Are you a painter, or are you someone who, the phrase that comes next is completely open, because the range of the range of practices that one can turn to as an artist is entirely open. There are no constraints. So I think when you've got that contrast between a subject that is quite has to be attentive to method and methodology on the one hand, and one that has arguably complete freedom, I think one needs to respect that difference. And so I would say that's a really key nitty-gritty detail.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the case, but I always pictured, artists being much more constrained there than they appear to be, and scientists being much more, whatever. Yeah, I have to do this now and this and then this. I mean, not so methodologically constrained. I mean, I don't know. Adrian.
I'd just love to dive in on this, like you just did a video, like this idea that sort of there aren't any constraints in art is a really interesting one, because I take it that, of course, there in fact are constraints, right? Because there's sort of, there's certain types of art I can't do because I don't have enough money to do it, for instance. So there are lots of like material constraints, but I take it the sort of difference is that, with science, there's a explicit community agreed upon procedure by which, like take peer review or something like that, through which you actually go and sort of get your thing done. Now, I suppose as someone who knows a lot more about science than do about art, I find myself immediately thinking that although there aren't constraints on the, as it were, the content necessarily of art, I imagine that there are enormous constraints in terms of the material conditions under which people are allowed to make art and actually sort of practice art. And so something I would love to hear from artists is like, what do you make of this claim or this idea that there aren't constraints? I imagine a anthropologist of art would find that a very strange claim indeed, right? So I'd love to have that question answered.
Yeah, I think Amma, would you like to say something about that?
Oh yeah, because I'm an artist, I just have to clarify a bit, like about our constraints, or about how do we actually approach these art science collaborations mostly. So sure, there are constraints, but I think we also have like a methodology, and you just navigate through all the constraints and you get the the final object or whatever concept you are about to work with.
Could you name one of those constraints?
Sure, you are invited to exhibit something, and you have like 3 weeks and a limited amount of budget, and yeah, you have an idea, a strong one, and you have to maybe just make something smaller, small size, or just decide on how to actually display the whole idea you have in mind. But what I think is interesting in the art science collaboration, and I want to know like your opinion about it, it's how do you relate to like new aesthetic assimilation into the visual arts? Let's say like bioart. You work with like living things, and for sure it's something about the aesthetic, like laboratory aesthetic, or like I don't know, science aesthetics. But also with like some critical stuff. Maybe you want to point out some limits of biotechnologies, or like limits of science, limits of ethical problems. I don't know. It's also about the content. When you start using some scientific methods or some scientific tools or scientific concepts, you usually think also about the a way to not necessarily critically engage, but also to show some limits of the things of technologically. I don't know.
I think, yeah, it's a great question, and I think I would initially go back to what I think is the condition of contemporary art, where as soon as you walk into that laboratory, the scope on what you could draw upon as an artist is, assuming the scientists have given permission, is essentially limitless. And I think it very much goes down to what aesthetic judgments you're applying as an artist. I think, because which aspect of that scientific method or activity do you want to work on and start to transform? And I think the fact you said you want to bring in a critical eye, you want to somehow, there's I think my question would be, what's inside that criticality? Are you wanting to, because criticality is itself is quite a complex word. It doesn't necessarily imply negativity, but you perhaps want to bring out an aspect of the, I forget what's the biogenetic process that you think is not, perhaps science is not calling attention to, and perhaps is slightly has a dark side or a slightly sinister side. So I think it very much comes down to what aesthetic judgments, i.e. what filters are at work within your aesthetic judgment.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's like, sure, you can bring into question some problems that can sparkle from, I don't know, scientific field, but I know some examples of work where I don't know, just presented the limit of biotechnology. There is some Australian artists who exhibited a work called "If Pig Could Fly" or something like that. And yeah, you just go there and see some petri dish with some tissue in it, very small piece, actually, not really resembling a real animal, and just some artificial grown tissue on some scaffold. So I think they wanted to point out the limits we have now on technology, because we all read like all sort of articles and they say, oh, scientists just discovered a way to grow like new teeth, or like, I don't know, all sort of very all sort of things that sounds like a very big deal, but they're maybe just at the very, very beginning of that research, and it just sounds like super big. So that's maybe one way of engaging art and technologies or science.
So this was a work where there was a pig and it had not
and now
very well.
art speaks like about the truth, because you read some articles and you imagine that's the truth. They discover a way of, I don't know, go young again, and yeah, when you actually try to do it, maybe it's not quite the reality of the of the now moment.
So what was there a work with a pig and some surgically attached wings? Have I understood that correctly?
No, it was just.
No, it wasn't.
I'm now googling for it, but I can't find it. I'll probably just post a link in the chat.
It's a lot more blobby than the name, but it's great to see. You will like it. I would just like to bring up that there is I think a huge distinction when it comes to contemporary art between works which are made in a laboratory, have a laboratory aesthetics or a bioart aesthetics, and those which have a clinical aesthetic. Because getting artists to actually shadow in clinical facilities and to create their work there, to take interviews of patients, to include private medical data, it's a lot more complicated, and it's a long-term process compared to a lot of bioart initiatives. For example, Mona Hatoum, when she did Clive Cazeaux in 1994, so this is an installation, a video installation of her, which is based on an endoscopic video of the artist's gastrointestinal tract. It took about 7 years for her to convince French doctors that this investigation should be done, because even if she was a healthy woman, they argued that 0.5 to 1% risk of some damage happening during the intervention was ethically wrong for them to do it. So it actually took 7 years and a lot of support from the French government in order for her to be able to make this very risk-free generally intervention for a woman her age and without complications. And this doesn't even involve only the artist's own body and their own private decisions. There's another British artist who is trying to do an installation with brain imaging taken from volunteers. And she has been rejected again and again because one of the arguments is, well, what if one of the volunteers discover that he or she has a brain tumor during these volunteer MRIs? You could argue that they signed up for this free investigation, but it wasn't what they initially would have wanted. They are not prepared for it. It is not as if you go to your GP, the GP refers you to a neurologist, and you already have this process and some form of support system. You're part of an art installation, and what, you just receive a call, hey, you have a brain tumor. You need to have a medical protocol for situations like this.
But I would say that the struggle that artists have to go through ethical approval might be an indication that what their work is doing is succeeding in that tradition of art being perhaps critical of certain medical practices. So
I agree.
And probably the documentation as a exhibition or a book would probably be really exciting reading. But I wasn't quite sure of the distinction you made at the start between a bio-art aesthetic and a clinical aesthetic.
So I'm referring to clinical more in what I will talk about a bit later in my presentation. So what is based on and around clinical encounters, the encounter between a patient and a physician. And I include in this certain types of medical imaging, which can only be obtained with basically doctor's orders and not by patients who just want an MRI, how Mona Hatoum would have wanted. So it is this art for which the clinician. So I have basically 3 categories. The artist, who is a patient, and he is undergoing investigation, and he bases his work on his own personal experiences. The cases of physician artists, who are very complex, both ethical-wise and in the intersection of the medical gaze and artistic gazes. And the case of the artists who have a penchant for the scientific methods and for medical science in general, who are very akin, I think, to bio-art artists, and sometimes they overlap with bio-art artists, and they usually obtain permission from clinics to shadow, to use certain technologies and include this in their work.
Okay, I look forward to your talk. I wasn't aware. I'm interested in the idea of a bio-art aesthetic, because given that the bios is processes of life, of formation, that seems such a rich and diverse area of inquiry. I can't imagine it having one aesthetic, but maybe I should wait for your talk.
No, I absolutely agree. I just wanted to basically sort of delineate the clinical from the biological in general, the medical clinical aesthetics based on the patient, compared to all the plethora of other bio-art experimentations and aesthetics.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. We have Cezara.
Yes, hey, I might have forgotten a couple of things I wanted to mention, so it's just going to be 2 very brief issues I'd like to bring up. First of all, on the issue of the appeal of science in arts, I think I hope it's going to relate to what Floriana was telling us earlier. I think art handles science in a very playful manner, and I think this is where the appeal lies, not necessarily in the fact that works of art dealing with science are breakthroughs in the scientific field, but the fact that potential failures can be a playful way of displaying art. Second of all, on what the issue of bioart is concerned, I wanted to mention concepts, methodology introduced by Roy Ascott, the British artist, technoetics, coming from techne and noetic, Greek terminology. It it's a concept. It used to be a concept. I'm not sure whether he adheres to this theory anymore of technoetic, but this had something to do with the connection between technological works, technology, and consciousness. And I think maybe bioarts is a branch, or is something that stems from this kind of artistic methodology. And one more thing I remember now, if I could just, and I promise it's also going to be brief. I was also thinking, as I was listening to you, Clive, I was thinking about this, the question for this panel, yeah, why art and science? And I realized we might be a bit biased because my presentation, as well as yours, is going to focus on the positive aspects of this interaction, of this connection between art and science. But there was a point in time, and maybe more. There was one point that I'm aware of in the past when this intersection wasn't as popular or wasn't as in demand as it is today. Today we have new media art, all of the different branches stemming from it, and so on. But for instance, I'm going to relate this to my own research on cybernetic art. There was a period of time, there was a decade, the 1970s and part of the 1980s as well, when cybernetic art wasn't visible. I could mention 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 major exhibitions having to do with cybernetic art, but not more. And the way it was promoted was at academic level. So artists were part of the academia as well. And I was just wondering, okay, so you can maybe use a different kind of tone to answer this question of why art and science. Okay, why art and science? I mean, yeah. I don't have an answer to this. It's just like random things I thought about while listening to you.
I think to respond to your last observation, I think if 30, 40 years ago, if there was less interest in cybernetic art science exchange, I think for two things. One, the art world is governed by this idea that art should be autonomous. It's not illustration, it is its own thing. It is exercising freedom, whether it's the freedom of the genius or some other kind of freedom. And I imagine there was probably the misperception, the false perception that if you're working with scientists, you're somehow compromising the art, which I don't agree with, but I think that might have been the worry. And I think secondly, as a result of the internet, as a result of postmodernism, I think there's been a rise of interest in interdisciplinarity, in subjects being very wary of their silo nature. So I think there has been a lot, and the danger of categories. So I think you've got two forces there that I would say that support your observation that 40 years ago this kind of work was not valued other than within academia. But I think now the platforms for it, as we saw yesterday and as a part of this talk series, I think is much more widespread.
But it's still paradoxical if you come to think about it, because in the very distant past, I'm thinking Leonardo da Vinci now, he wasn't just an artist, he was an inventor, which is basically a scientist as well. So if you go even further back in time, then the 20th century, let's say 19th century as well, and the typical philosophers and philosophical theories as well. I mean, you might notice the distinction between artists and scientists wasn't even there at all. Da Vinci is the first name that came to my mind, but I can come up with others as well if you want.
But I think that's what I was trying to indicate in my first slide, that modernity has carved these subjects, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, and it's there in the 17th century with the split between rationalism and empiricism. So I think, and it's only in perhaps the past century that work's been done to try and overcome these splits. In philosophy, I think it would be down to phenomenology, trying to get away from binaries. But I think the last century has been the century that has tried to be very critical of binary thinking.
Thanks.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. We're running a bit late, so I think we're gonna end at this point, and I will ask Cezara to share her screen.
Okay, 1 second. I'm probably not going to be able to touch on all of the points I wanted to in the first place. The way I thought about the question of why art and science was in terms of spatiality, spatial anchoring, and I thought I'd focus on modern exhibition spaces, of which I'm only going to mention two examples. And I initially wanted to include a case study, the Ars Electronica Center, also called the Museum of the Future. I'm not sure whether there's going to be enough time to do that. So to get right into it, my inquiry has to do with what kind of transformations are noticeable in terms of this intertwinement of science and art at the level of modern exhibition spaces. I identified a number of concepts which are relevant for contemporary art and contemporary art spaces, and a number of them are archive, aesthetics, memetics, authorial intention, and co-creation. These are all essentially concepts that have been discussed extensively in the past century as well, but in my opinion, they have undergone some state of some level of transformation in the present century. And then maybe we can come up with a couple of open questions together. So the two art spaces, exhibition spaces that I wanted to focus on are the theory, the image of the white cube, and that of the pop-up museum. In the case of the former, there are critical texts on this subject describing the white cube as the exhibition space. I included a picture, the first one to the left, of one of the white cube galleries in London, designed by a famous architect. And this kind of structure basically implies a certain trajectory, a certain direction for ideas of shape, texture, and light. So basically, the shape of the exhibition space had to be either a square, would have to be a square one with wide walls where artifacts would have to be can be exhibited. No distinguishable textures, so you could focus. The focus would be on the artifacts themselves, with the light coming from above. This is the traditional idea of the exhibition of the art space. Nowadays, we're seeing loads of pop-up museums or pop-up galleries. They're quite popular finding in malls, for instance. And the picture in the middle is an exhibition, pop-up exhibition space from an Asian mall. It's a bit different here because we have to count on artificial light here as well. Whereas in the first image, the image of a white cube type of exhibition space, there's also natural light. So nowadays, while we still have this traditional idea of the white cube, it's sort of, you can see some visible transformations taking place. And the last picture to the right is an image of the deep space 8K exhibition space from the Ars Electronica Center, where you can definitely see the difference. The audience is basically immersed in the exhibition content, with projections happening all around. So you wouldn't just walk through the space, and get to contemplate, get to spend time in front of the actual artifacts, but you would actually be part of them. And this is where issues of co-creation come in. And I think the reason why there's a question mark there after the word formal is because I was thinking whether you can also make a distinction or some kind of like identify differences between these three types actually of spaces. I should have included number 3 as well for the Deep Space 8K lab. Whether you can identify issues of formal versus informal spaces. White Cube is traditionally associated with large museums, large art museums, history museums as well, whereas pop-up museums, as well as the kind of projectional space that covers all of the ground, the floor as well as the ceiling and so on, and the surrounding walls, would be slightly informal. So this is just a question I'm putting out there. And in terms of the concepts that I came across while researching this issue, I included 4 here. In terms of aesthetics, I think Clive and Adrian have tackled this subject. So perhaps we can look at what is relevant in our art today in terms of including science in it. And I think we've talked about this as well, so I'm probably going to skip it. What is the place of materiality? I think again this question has already been posed. What makes an artifact relevant nowadays? Again, this question. Yeah, we've talked about this. Now, in terms of authorial intention, I was curious as to what the public would make of an immersive space such as the Deep Space 8K from the Ars Electronica Center. How would you consume this type of an artifact, an installation? Yeah, let's say you're watching a video, and the video is all around, it surrounds you, not just image but sound as well. Okay, is it relevant that the author has conceptualized this artifact without actually thinking about the space that it's going to be exhibited in? Does the fact that you are consuming, that you are looking at, let's say, a video, an installation, while being in a Deep Space 8K, does it change the author's practice, artistic practice and intention? In terms of what is still familiar and what has changed, I think I've touched on that while mentioning the actual space where art is being exhibited and actually perceived, consumed. And while we're on this issue, again, I just want to maybe pose, like, get a couple of questions across, and then maybe we can look at them from different angles, from you as philosophers, from us as artists or art critics. I was thinking about also in terms of economics, what would enable somebody to buy a digital piece of art, a digital artifact? What kind of aspects would make us refrain from acquiring such a piece of art? Bioart included here. Would you be able, or would you like to buy anything that is labeled bioart? And if so, how would you be able to preserve it, to archive it? And these are basically a couple of questions I've thought about, and I'm going to stop here. Thank you. Sorry if it was all over the place. I'm kind of tired and kind of sick, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Cezara. Well, I think I was thinking about doing this. So Adrian has to leave at like 9 Romanian time. So I think I would take his question and then move on to Diana's presentation, and we can have more questions afterwards. Is that okay?
Sure, sure, it's perfect. Thanks.
Great. Adrian?
Thanks, Cezara. Like, I really love the way you were sort of thinking about the kind of context in which art is kind of presented and what difference that kind of makes. And it started me thinking about sort of a concept that I really like that aestheticians use, is the notion of a sort of prescriptive frame. So there's this thing where when you go and you interact with a piece of art, there are kind of rules about how you're supposed to do it. You know, like I'm supposed to, if I'm looking at a painting, I'm not supposed to look behind the painting, or, you know, that like I'm supposed to be a certain distance from it. And the spaces in which art is kind of presented really shapes that prescriptive frame, right? So the space of, you know, the classical art gallery really affords a certain set of ways in which you're supposed to interact, right? And it led me to start thinking about like, wow, so when you think, you know, the different sorts of context in which you might present artworks really change the artwork, right? Because it changes the prescriptive frame in certain ways. One of the cases I was thinking of was I recently was in New Zealand for the first time in ages, and the town I grew up in, Christchurch, had a really big earthquake about, gosh, like a decade ago now. But one of the upshots of this is that large amounts of the city were leveled, right? And often these were like buildings in between other buildings. And people started basically just like making art in these unused sort of broken urban spaces. And they're still kind of there. And one thing that's really interesting about, you know, some of them are murals, but sometimes they're much weirder. They're very, you know, very, very surreal, interesting things that people have just kind of cobbled together. And I take it that one thing that's interesting about it is that the place is critical, right? The fact that this is a thing, it's a way of in response to a kind of disaster that's really shattered people's lives, being able to create something beautiful or funny or moving or something in this sort of broken space is really important. So it's kind of interesting that, I guess, this is more of a sort of comment than a question, I suppose, is I think it's interesting that the prescriptive frame seems to, you know, sometimes space is helping set that. It's telling me how to interact with the artwork. But also sometimes the place and where it is fundamental to what the artwork is kind of saying. And so I think it's really interesting the way that you're focusing on the context in which the art's presented. Again, not really a question, sorry.
Thanks. No, it's perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. So I think we should move on to Diana's presentation. Diana, would you like to share the screen?
Yes. Just 1 second, please. So are you all seeing it?
Yep, everything's great.
Okay. I have a lot of slides, but I will go very fast and we can have the discussion afterwards and you can ask me anything about it. So first of all, hi everyone, my name is Diana Andreea Novaceanu. I'm a MD, I'm a PhD candidate, and I'm also the art and creativity editor at Synapsis, a health humanities journal. And the subject I'm speaking about tonight relates to my thesis, which is titled Clinical Encounters, the Medical Imaginary in Contemporary Visual Arts, which deals with the period from 1945 to 2021. And I basically study 3 categories. I study artists who created clinical work on the basis of their personal health and illness journey, artists with an interest in medical technologies and paraphernalia, which necessitate either the undergoing of specific protocols and collaborations to obtain the necessary content to enter the clinical establishment, and physician artists, both amateur and trained professionals in both fields. And a big part of all these categories is the collaborative practices between physician and artist and patient and artist. So how do I define clinical encounters? A very general definition would be any physical and virtual contact between a patient and healthcare practitioner during which clinical activity is performed. What I'm looking at is how viewers relate to such a place and to a position where they are not supposed to be in. Almost everybody has been a patient, has gone to a hospital once or twice in their lives, has attended a clinical encounter, maybe as a concerned friend, maybe as a carer. But what is different in seeing things from the perspective of the artist, or even more so from the perspective of an artist who is also a physician? What is most visible and expressive for a viewer that does not possess the physician's medical gaze? What does it take for the viewer to be transported into the clinical space outside of its physical limits? How much may the clinical be altered before it turns into an entity of its own? I'm not going to go into the history of the contemporary medical clinic and how it was mapped out from its beginnings by Michel Foucault, but it is very important to note how basically this whole space of the proto-clinic, this place in which the epistemic changes were taking place, in which basically the way in which physicians looked at the human body and looked at the sign and the symptom and anything related to illness changed. This sort of knowledge is a very potent means for a lot of contemporary visual artists who deal with documents from the time, who deal with medical textbooks from the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and who repurpose the information and they investigate the histories of, let's say, the poor people who were used as test subjects during the time, the bodies, the anonymous bodies we have in medical museums right now, and they probe into all the ethical issues which basically sort of surround this history of the clinic, which was not a straightforward evolution in no way or sense. And leaning on clinical knowledge and its means of productions, such artists basically make their own maps of health and illness, marking the interactions which punctuate the landscape. Their medical imaginaries, based on lived experience, is not quantifiable through clinical research, and thus they offer a glimpse into that preclinical, that proto-clinical space, which differs so much from the clinic of the 21st century. I will give you one example. For example, this Polish artist, Cătălin Creţu, she was suffering from cancer while she undertook this portrait. And she describes the reaction the medical practitioners had to its exhibit. The sister, the medical nurse who was taking care of her, became really upset by the nature of the photo, and the artist couldn't understand why. She puts it very bluntly: she didn't want to see me anymore after that. She shouted at me, "Get out of my sight." I really didn't understand. After all, she had always given me the IV, only now I was naked. I don't know what happened there, but I felt cheated by them, misunderstood. It's just ended and that's it. But we're still friends, the doc and I. So she's basically regarding her experience and how things went wrong with this medical collaboration, how her recording her clinical encounters and repurposing the material in an artistic way end up basically breaking the patient-physician and patient-nurse relationship. And this also happened in the case of Jo Spence, a British artist who was very critical of the medical establishment. At a certain point, she had her bag checked by the nurses to see if she was taking more photos of the hospital. I would like to go back to the painting which inspired Caterina, Edouard Manet's Olympia, and make a very important point. When Manet exhibited Olympia in 1865, a lot of its criticism was very clinical. So, for example, critics noted that the body's putrefying color recalls the horrors of the morgue. They said that Olympia was like a corpse on the counters of the morgue, that it was in a state of decomposition. And another critic goes even further and says that she is like a skeleton dressed in a tight-fitting tunic of plaster. And this takes us basically to the whole complicated relations, interdependent relations of medicine and the visual arts. So for the past 200 years, clinical medicine has redrawn the relation between not only sign, symptom, and illness, but the balance between public and private surveillance of state and self-surveillance. And it has also stemmed an aesthetic which illuminates, interprets, and appraises the experience of illness and other medical phenomena. But it is very important for art historians and for scholars of the medical humanities to simultaneously probe its implications on artistic theory and practice, to go far beyond the role of artist as illustrator mapping the body in a way in which doctors could perfect their medical gaze, or to the physicians who have turned to artistic careers. It is very important to see how clinical terminology, how the clinical way of seeing the body has impacted the visual arts. And we have certain nuclei in history where arts get very clinical. For example, in the 1870s and 1880s, a lot of Parisian art was concerned with laboratories, with the processes of Pasteur and pasteurization and the invention of vaccines. And it is not only portraits of famous scientists which were being exhibited in salons. A lot of the language and the insights of the critics were related to medical terminology. And again, at the beginning of the 20th century in Vienna, we had another very clinical nuclei in the circle of Figue and Schiele, which was very concerned with representation of clinical bodies and of clinical spaces. Foregoing conventional delineations, I assert that the clinical space must be viewed simultaneously as a place of transcendence, of transformation, of hybridization, of ambivalence, of surveillance, and most importantly, a space of the interpenetration of divergent gazes, the artistic and the medical gaze. It is also important to note that the current clinical paradigm is not immobile, and researchers have proposed certain paradigms changes from the late 20th century onwards, such as surveillance medicine, escapes medicine, digital health, which all relate to the way in which basically the clinical encounter has changed and how medical data has escaped the confines of the hospital and the new roles patients now possess with their own information in the 21st century. And I propose also the term of artscaped medicine, which includes several potentialities. First of all, art therapy has had an outstanding growth, mostly all over the Western world, but at the same time, medical humanities initiatives have brought the artist back in the clinic. A lot of places now have collaborative practices between art students and medical students. Medical students are taught to draw, maybe in an effort to improve their clinical skills, but also as a way to promote personal wellness and to give them an outlet. The way in which hospital architecture is designed now includes a lot of gallery-like spaces and is a lot more concerned with aesthetics than ever previously. And there are also a lot of other artscaped initiatives I won't go into right at this moment, relating the aspect of data, of personal medical data. Now it has become a tool and material for artistic research and expression. And by this I mean that the data from biowebs and trackers, from forensic databases, genomic mapping, public health inquiries, data amassed from social media platforms or the request of the artist as part of collaborative projects. This has all been used in interdisciplinary, digital usually, or otherwise multimedia contemporary visual arts projects. There are, of course, a plethora of ways in which artists are inspired by the clinical encounter and by the relationship between physician and patient. I am just going to briefly show you a few slides of how this very in medium and representation. But what I would like to briefly get into is, again, the issue of the artist using his own body as a material. This poses grave ethical implications for the physicians involved. And as I have previously given the example for Mona Hatoum, it took about 7 years for her to be able to have this investigation performed and use the footage in an artistic installation. There are also the cases of collaborative practices between patients, physicians, and artists, which may be in university capacity, conducted through basically research facilities, but they may also be impromptu friendships, such is the case of Roy Cullen and John Bellany. John Bellany, with a quite famous British artist, and he required a liver transplant in the late 80s, and he was operated on by Professor Cullen, who is a leading surgeon, hepatic general transplants surgeon. And afterwards, while he recovered, he did approximately 60 sketches of his clinical life in the recovery ward. As you can see, this one was dedicated to the professor, and the picture on the right shows how his hospital room looked like, something which was possible in the late 80s. I don't think an artist would get permission to hang his work like this right now. At the same time, Qolony was also quite a talented artist, and he was doing his own series of pictures of the transplant he was realizing. They struck a very short but very artistically productive friendship, in which basically Qolony took painting lessons from Bellany, which ultimately changed his style. I find this very interesting, how in one of the lessons he painted me and I painted him. So you have this reversal of roles in a way, and of gazes, in the way in which they came together and painted each other. And Qolony on his own became quite famous among patients for his portraits he took. And at one time, when he was beginning the clinical encounter, instead of the regular questions, he got asked, "When are you going to paint me?" So this again showcases just how fickle the relations of a physician artist with his patient may be, and the ethical implications. And concerning the way in which a physician may get the patient's approval to portray them, I found this solution by Ruslan Melin, a Russian artist, very interesting. So he's a Siberian facial surgeon who treats women affected by domestic violence. And in order to protect their privacy, he draws their wounds using the facial features of fellow doctors from the clinic. And of course, he has the consent of both parties. I'm not going to go into how the clinic is brought into exhibitional spaces right now. I will just briefly go into what I find is a sort of post-human future of the clinic. So this is an installation by Revital Cohen from 2008 called Life Support, in which she imagines and designs a transgenic lamp which purifies the blood of someone who is in need. And this showcases that clinical encounters transcend human borders, because we also have the encounters between animal and animal doctors, and the whole cycle can be brought together through the vision of some artists, which also poses very interesting both artistic and ethical problems. Finally, I would say that the contemporary works of art dealing with clinical encounters are very much a showcasing of a post-human clinical landscape. They bring together the molecular gaze, genetic clinical encounters, the hybrid body, the cyborg body, and the body as a clinically manipulated living work of bioart. And as a final slide, I will bring you the Hospital of the Future. This is a snapshot from a very short film produced in 2021 by the OMA agency in the Netherlands. What this movie is about is how how Western clinical medicine was expected to progressed up until now. It had a very steady pace generally, even if it has its own issues with antibiotic resistance and lifestyle factor generated illnesses. But what this current pandemic has showcased is just how easily they are overcome, and how the clinical establishment is an extremely delicate ecosystem. And they have imagined this hospital of the future in which everything is in a constant flux. It is like a theater with its choreography, transforming its space to the event. They proposed that everything could be 3D printed, that medical waste could be used as building blocks to generate the needed equipment in an attempt to become self-sufficient. They say that the hospital of the future is a place where you will never go. And through this monitoring of the data I have previously spoke about, it would be a sort of panopticon, a very powerful surveillance structure, which would know everything which would be happening to the patient. But at the same time, the hospital of the future will give away to the machine, liberating its staff from routine tasks and even precision in the hands of accurate devices. Finally, the authors ask, if it became automatic, could be the hospital of the future be more human? Question for the philosophers. Thank you very much. I will stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana. If you have questions, please raise your hand. Adrian.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to have to go fairly soon, so thank you for putting me in. Diana, I'm really interested in this idea of the way in which taking art into the sort of medical context, which is to say doing art, you know, while in a hospital, while speaking to a doctor, while doing these things, is sort of profoundly challenging and subversive in terms of the way that medical structures work. And so what I was thinking was, I think you saw the idea of sort of medical surveillance and the sort of panopticon idea. You know, so the idea is you sort of act as if you're being watched the whole time. I guess the other thing I was thinking of is that there's a sense in which there's a lot of stuff in hospitals that really work at sort of restricting your autonomy in very, very specific ways. So you're allowed to make judgments in the context of, you know, medical establishments, and very staged managed, very kind of careful. There are lots about hospitals, and medical stuff generally really encourages passivity and a kind of, you know, that you're not really encouraged to be a very sort of critical, engaged, autonomous being very often in these kind of medical contexts. And I wonder to what extent that sort of goes towards explaining how angry people in the medical establishment get when, or at least in those cases, those historical cases you talked about, when art gets brought in, because art is at least, you know, reactive and discursive and subversive in exactly the ways that you're not supposed to be when you're being sort of stage managed through a kind of medical sort of thing. So I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts on.
You are exactly right. Just to give a very fast answer, because I know you have to leave. So I have recently participated at a conference about hospital architecture and the future of hospital spaces. And a lot of the discussions taking place were about how patients feel in all these hospitals, which is, like I said, are made with help from like aesthetic philosophers and the designers and everybody from the aesthetic field brought together to give the best in-person experience. And generally, up until now, the response hasn't been very good. It ranges from, but why did they spend all this money on this? Couldn't they have made the bigger rooms so I have more space if I'm staying here for 3 weeks? To, just like I said, a revolt about who are these artists? Why have they been picked? Why didn't you choose lay art made by the people who are here? Are you afraid that they're going to showcase something which you do not want to put on your walls? Like, this is a very valid question, and there has also been problems with hospitals commissioning artwork from artists going into the clinic, speaking with patients, basically doing like a week-long or month-long process and coming up with the work, and then the hospital refuses to pay it or refuses to display it because it does not go with their perceived standards for what could be exhibited in a clinical space. And if you go by the very Puritan standards of what could be exhibited in a clinical space, then 95% of contemporary art wouldn't see a hospital inside.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, it was lovely speaking with you.
Okay.
Hi, Diana. Thank you for your talk. A fantastic topic. I was just intrigued in regarding what are the differences between the different kind of reactions you've got from the three categories of kind of people you're looking at. So you've got patients, then you've got artists either as patients or as perhaps visitors, and then you've got the medical professionals. I imagine there's a very diverse range of different responses.
It's a vast category.
But are there any clusters?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, for example, I find that most artists who are interested in obtaining, let's say, images like MRI images or any other artifacts of this sort, they're generally very science-minded. And like I said, they may have worked on bioart projects in the past or any technology-related projects. And they tend to think a lot like scientists, so they do not tend to interact with the patients much, maybe just in order to obtain volunteers and to explain to them the process and how the images will be used. But generally, they prefer projects in which they mingle with scientists, with medical scientists, with laboratory people, with the clinical scientists, so and so. But they are very attracted to the whole scientific process and how exactly are those artifacts on the MRI? How exactly does the physician interpret them and make sense of them? And how is the medical gaze basically built? And how is it enhanced by technology? So I would find that there are quite a large cluster of the artists who interact with the clinic. And also you have the artist visitors. I think rarely most of the artists who engage like through their personal experience are either suffering from a chronic disease. Let's say they have had cancer, or they have an autoimmune disease, or they may have a disability, and they come in frequent contact with medical practitioners. And a lot of those their frustrations stem from the fact that they are so often in contact and they get to see certain aspects, certain less savory aspects of the medical establishment and of the clinical relationship. Whereas for physician artists, being a physician myself, they are my favorite group. They're extremely interesting because on one side, you have this idea now in medical schools to promote interdisciplinary initiatives, to get them to take courses of narrative writing or drawing courses. And in a way, it stems from this idea, let's make the gentleman physician, the romantic gentleman physicians of the 19th century again, who is good at a bit of everything, and he is a very cultured individual. And maybe this will help him or her in the interactions in the clinic with patients from different cultures and so on. But at the same time, this is possible only for as long as that the physician doesn't do anything which is very critical of the establishment, or even for as long as he or she does not want to make it into let's say not even a career, but a more steady artistic presence, because then it would impact their clinical time. So it is a very delicate balance they have to maintain. For example, I have collaborated whilst writing my thesis with artists who have basically finished studies at Harvard, at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, in Canada, at the University of Toronto, in a lot of places, and they have told me how having their medical preparation and their artistic preparation at the same time has been basically a hellish experience, not time-wise, because they're used to, as physicians, to coping with such problems, but from the attitudes they have received from colleagues, from both people in the art establishment and the medical establishment. It's very much of choose your camp approach. You won't be able to do this professionally, to do both professionally. If you do one mistake one time and you are critical of the medical establishment, then that career go bust and so on. So I think that is the reason why most of physician artists choose non-clinical subjects. Like 90% of them choose non-clinical subjects. They may be inspired by the clinical. They may want to, they may have studies and sketches. I have been shown studies and sketches, but they will declare, I am not going to act upon this until I get retirement.
Okay, thank you.
I'm
thank
ready
you.
I'm ready to ask a
Yeah,
question
yeah,
now.
please.
Of course.
That's okay. I forgot my to lower my hand. Sorry, now.
No worries.
Oh, okay.
Diana, I was wondering, during your research, have you come across any specific differences between, I hate to essentialize this, but between the East and the West, like perhaps a Western way of
yes,
or
yes.
attitude? Because the way you displayed your examples was the Russian artist who was rejected, the physician
Yes.
whose art was rejected. And the patient and the doctor, I'm guessing, were they English or?
Yes, they were English, and that is a very good observation. I actually heard a presentation on this theme a few months ago at Manchester. Basically, most of so there are a plethora of representations of the clinical encounter from the Eastern Bloc. But 99% of them, of course, are in a socialist, realist tradition, and they were made with the purpose to highlight how the Soviet states had the best medical systems in the world, and all the patients could get the care which was shown in those, let's say, paintings. But here is where it gets interesting, because a lot of them are quite subversive. For example, I noticed the use of X-rays in quite a lot of these. Like, even if the doctor, for example, he's a surgeon or he's a podiatrist or any other specialty, he's shown looking at the X-ray. And I find it as a way, like a very veiled critique of the Soviet system in general, because this gaze can be viewed in several ways. It can be viewed as a sort of the state sees what you are doing, the panopticon of the medical gaze. Like, the doctor is an agent of the state. He is required, especially in Russia, they were required to give out a lot of information they found from their patients and to testify in court and so on. But at the same time, the doctors had very low salaries and they were bribed, and they knew a lot of the illegal things happening in the town. And looking at the X-rays were basically looking eyes wide shut at what was going on around them. And some of those portraits are also given as thanks from the patients to the doctors in this sort of gift economy, which basically kept the medical system alive in Soviet times. So when you look at it, there are so many strata in Soviet depictions. And also, I think there it showcases the role of the artist. Well, yes, you may survey what is going on around you, but I am also surveying you when I am taking this portrait. And this is my variant of you. And you cannot deny me this. There have been portraits of physicians, for example, a physician who was sent by Stalin to Siberia, and after Stalin's death, his colleagues paid for a portrait in which he was reinstated at his desk, and he's shown along with his colleagues at his desk as if he had never died in Siberia. So when you think of Russian clinical art, it is extremely interesting. And I'm sorry, I'm very tired today if I haven't made sense with everything.
No, it was great. Thanks. I was just thinking. I googled the name of the photographer from former Czechoslovakia. I think his name is pronounced. I'm gonna write it down for everybody. Jan Saudek. It's written Saudek, and he was actually his photographs were rejected in his country of origin, but he was published by Taschen in Germany, so he gained prominence there. And I'm just thinking, like, this is another example of
certainly
an artist, well, European, yeah, and of different attitudes, yeah. And I think it has to do with politics here as well. There's some sort of like beyond ethics, beyond ethical criteria. I think it has to do with politics, definitely, as you also mentioned.
For sure, and you also have to, we have to take into consideration that a lot of the medical humanities and arts initiatives which started taking place in the West in the 80s were simply not possible in Eastern Europe. So I have made research, I've read the interviews of artists and physicians who came to Russia in 1991, 1992, or in the 80s, and they were surveying the situations of having 2 light bulbs for a whole building which would work. Like, how can you have the artist in the building to make that installation or whatever he wants to do? It was simply not possible. Like, even if you would have found a willing physician, the conditions were simply not there. And I have read an interview with a Russian cardiologist who's chief of one of the biggest clinics in the country. And he was saying exactly the same thing. Like, I know that in the West you have all these projects which involve artists and physicians, and I would be very happy to have that for my own doctors, to get them to think in new ways, to get them to make new connections, because I do believe that art is a huge help in perfecting the medical gaze. But at the same time, I do not have the means to simply pay someone for 1 month or offer lodging or anything like that. So I cannot extend this offer to Russian artists, and it is very complicated to bring an artist from outside the country in Russia. So I think that we have all these factors which not prevent but severely inhibit the evolution of certain clinical projects in Eastern Europe for the time.
Cool, thank you. I do have one question myself. I was really, so I think the concept you presented of artscape medicine is really, really interesting. But I was curious about, its connection with kind of the well-being of human life. So say someone's on his or her deathbed, and some form of art can be, kind of made for him in order to, let's say, experience something good. I was wondering about this kind of well-being aim of this type of art, because many things you showed, many types of art you show, they're kind of discomforting, right?
Yes, I agree.
Mean, they seem really, they don't seem to hint at any well-being. They don't seem to be the kind of things I would want to look at at my deathbed, right? So I was thinking about what's your opinion about, this kind of feature of this type of art.
So there is the reverse of the coin, like you said, art more centered on well-being. In the United Kingdom, they have a program called Art on Prescription, in which, let's say that you are depressed and you go to your GP and you have already tried several bouts of treatment and it doesn't work. And they will give you a prescription to an art organization in which they try to include you in artistic initiatives. Maybe you would like to learn how to paint, or maybe you just like to read in the center's garden and watch the artists doing their work. And slowly they try to incorporate you in certain social initiatives and try to work with your medical condition or with your disability and see what exactly from their many art connection can help you in a way. And for example, like you said, in the case of someone who is close to passing, who let's say is in a palliative care institution, they may call around and see, okay, which museum may lend us a work which that person might like. Was he a sailor? Would he like to look at a 19th century picture of a port? It may not be a painting by Turner, but it would still be a good painting from a museum collection. Would he like a curator to come and to tell him stories of painters who were on board on ships and so on? So we have this cycle based on, if not recovery, on wellness and well-being.
So there is such a thing. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, cool. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Well, I think if there are no other questions, I think I will thank everyone. We are running a bit late anyway, so I would like to thank all the speakers. Thank you, Cezara. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Clive, and thank you, Adrian. And I would also like to thank the speakers from yesterday's panel and the day before yesterday and the day before that. Before coming to an end, we have to do some mandatory thanking. So this whole project, the whole Qolony Fusion Talks project, was funded by the Romanian Ministry of Culture. I'm going to say this in Romania because I think this is the way it should be done. So, proiectul Fusion Talks a fost organizat de Asociația Qolony cu sprijinul Ministerului Culturii prin programul Acces 2021. Good, I think that was it. I think that's great. Our partners include the Cultural Forum, the Embassy of France in Romania, the French Institute, the Embassy of the Netherlands in Romania. Our partners also include Points Hub, CESI, which is the Center for the Excellence in the Study of Image. And our media partners are Radio România Cultural, the Institute, DOR, which is Decât o Revistă, Bookhub, Modernism, Noi3.life, Propagarta, Agerpress, Știință și Tehnică, L Magazine, and IQ Ads. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much for, funding and participating in this event. And before coming to an end and thanking our viewers as well, I would like to introduce tonight's performance with which the event is gonna end. And it's an artistic work by Cătălin Creţu, which is called Amintiri din Subterrană. So this would be basically memories from the underground. And his work is a blend of music and video, which is partly generated by an algorithmic score. So it's partly his own creation and partly interpreted by a computer algorithm. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, for being with us. Thanks to all our speakers, and it was really great. I've learned a lot, and I think we can say that this has been a successful event. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And congrats all of
Thank
you.
you.
Congrats.
Yes, thank you to you, Ovidiu, for hosting, and to Michaela.
Thank you as well.
And also to Floriana for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you, everybody. It was great. I think we kind of needed like 5 hours or something to get on the
Yeah, definitely.
closer topic to actually interact and elaborate more on the art and science conjunction.